Well, hey guys, can you hear me? Give me a thumbs up. Gavin, you got a camera? Hey, we even got our Turo here today. Everybody got cameras? Uh-oh, I gotta go turn my other monitor off. Hang on. Did I scare you all when you got kicked out of your class earlier this week? Crystal, you're eating again. Is it any good? All right.
Chicken.
Chicken. All right. I had to have peanut butter toast. All right. Arturo, you got a camera or are you on an iPhone?
Yeah, I'm on an iPhone, but I have a camera.
Okay. Sorry about the mix up with dropping you guys all out of the class, but I got back in and your grades all came back. Trust me, it was a panic on my part. But anyway. All right. So today we're going to start off, going to cover the history, give you a little bit of background of what a diesel engine is, where it came from, all of that. And we're going to try to take apart a diesel and see how they work, what makes a diesel different than a gas engine and how it works. And then how it's going to, from there, some of the different characteristics that make them unique. And then we'll see how far we get today, and Thursday we may start into the fuel system depending on how long this takes me. But probably going to be in here for the long haul tonight. So buckle down. Let me just start. Let me get a screen up here. Let me back this thing up. And there we go. So let's talk about the history of the diesel engine. Where in the world did it come from? If we went back in the beginning of the Industrial Revolution and all that, everybody was trying to do something to try to get something away from the horse and buggy and the using horses as machinery, using windmills as power to run, water wheels to run factories and stuff like that. We needed to have some kind of a reliable source of power to do that. Back in somewhere in the 1712-ish area, the first steam engine was figured out, and they were able to use steam. Steam, though, is exceedingly inexpensive, and it was really inefficient. Steam engines are an example of an external combustion engine. Remember that a gas engine or a diesel engine, those are internal combustion. In other words, the fuel that is exploded to make the energy is internal to the engine. If you took a steam engine or something like that, it is external. We burn the fuel for that externally to make the steam to make the thing work. But it was exceedingly inefficient for the amount of energy you got out of that steam engine for how much fuel you use. It wasn't very efficient and very expensive to make, and they were very dangerous because a lot of steam engines like to blow up because they're under pressure and stuff like that. But if we look at the whole diesel thing as a whole, what this slide's kind of saying here is that there was a time, probably maybe 5 years ago, where the world was trying to phase diesel out because of the way it polluted and the way it did things. But with the technologies that we have today and the way things are going, the diesel engines are much cleaner than a gas engine, and we can get a whole lot more fuel economy. They're just a whole lot better all the way around. So I think that in the future, as we move forward in the future, I see us having diesels in a lot more areas and in a lot more use. Okay. So, but the big question is where they come from, how long have they been around? and we're going to talk about it. We're even here it says there was a mysterious death involved with it. Okay, so who is Rudolf Diesel? He was the dude that's the diesel engine carries his name. He's the guy who invented it. He was born in France, grew up in France, left France, go to England to go to get away from a war. Ended up coming back during the Industrial Revolution to study engine design. And think about what was the year 1861-ish, somewhere in the early 1860s is when Otto invented the four-stroke engine. Okay, that was the internal combustion engine. So, but it had its limits too, because remember that the Otto engine, the four-stroke engine, was about 10% efficient. In other words, all the heat energy that went into make it with a gallon of gas, only 10% of that gallon was used to make energy. So it was a big fat waste of gas. Okay. Diesel thought through the theories of thermodynamics that he could take and make an engine that would be almost 75% efficient. Okay. He never accomplished that, but it was his goal. So he got what 25% efficiency out of his engine, his first engine. However, that was twice as much as the gas engines of the day of the Otto cycle engine. The problem that he had though is that his engines were unreliable. Let's think about a gas engine, how simple it was. You just kind of have a carburetor dumping gas into a Otto cycle engine, and it worked pretty simply. The diesel engine was very complicated because you have to have something that's and we'll get into how they operate, but they operate based on compression ignition, and then we inject some sort of fuel into that cylinder to make it fire, and it becomes difficult to do. And his first engines, the first engines he has, and we'll talk about this today, and we're going to talk about it next week. His first engines actually used coal dust. They used powdered coal dust, and he injected that powdered coal dust into the cylinder to fire the cylinder. Okay. And so just think about how trying to come up with a system that's going to spray, powder into a cylinder that's under compression to try to make it operate was exceedingly inefficient and wrought with problems. So at the end of the day, Diesel had a lot of problems with his engine, and a lot of people were unhappy with him, and they ended up bringing him back to him. So he was under this big financial stress because he was going broke. Okay. So the one place that he did find success though was the French Navy wanted diesel engines in their submarines. Okay. Think about having a gasoline engine in a submarine, how volatile gasoline is and how dangerous that is, to have gasoline. You know how easy it is for gasoline to light on fire and to explode because it's very volatile. Okay. Whereas diesel is much more stable, and we don't have the problems with fumes catching on fire and stuff like that. So it made the diesel engine a much more desirable engine to have in a boat. Now, keep in mind that he's not trying to inject coal dust into his engines anymore. He started by the late 1890s. Did I even give you any dates? He invented his engine probably 1890-ish. And then it was in those 1890s where he would continue to develop his diesel engine. But so he had some success selling his engines, putting them in submarines. But that was about the extent of his success. He was on his way over to England to sell the English his idea on submarines, putting the engines in submarines. When somewhere on the English Channel, he went overboard. Okay. So they don't know if he jumped. Most people think that he jumped because he was he had financial problems and he just committed suicide. But they don't know if he jumped, or somebody threw him overboard because they didn't want the British to get his information. Big petroleum companies were threatened because his diesel engines were running on vegetable oil, which we'll talk about in the future. Steam, the same way the diesel engine was trying to make the steam engine irrelevant. Germany was worried that they were going to, get the U-boat designs. And so all kinds of theories and stuff go around it. But at the end of the day, the dude died. Okay. And and so he never really got to see his diesel engine put to any real practical use. Okay. But eventually armies would use them for everything, and governments would in the beginning. We use them for all kinds of things, and today we use them for running pipelines, power plants, cars, trucks, boats, factories, you name it, we use it. Okay. The early diesels that were built in the, starting in the early 20s and stuff were big and heavy, and really only used suitable for boats and factories and stuff like that. It was Robert Bosch who developed systems, high pressure fuel systems that could actually be more compact, that could actually make a smaller engine that could go in a car. Okay. So in 29, Cummins, he founded the Cummins Engine Company, which is the Cummins engine that we have. Dodge uses Cummins, and Cummins is, Ford used Cummins in their 650s and stuff for years, but a very, been around forever, Cummins diesel engines. Okay. And then in 36, Mercedes-Benz put the first diesel engine into a passenger car. The problems that most of the diesels have had over all the years, from up until even to the early 90s, was that they had problems starting cold, because remember, these things are compression ignition. The compression ignition is from heat, so they have problems starting cold. They're noisy, they blow black smoke, they stink, they slow to accelerate, they're expensive to buy originally. They have oil pressure problems, they leak, you name it. Nobody wanted to have a diesel. Okay. So those are all the problems that kind of wrapped around the whole idea of putting diesel engines into automotive, in small trucks and small automotive unit applications. Now, Cummins, this is just a little side note. Cummins, actually, this is the car that he raced in the 1931 Indianapolis 500. Okay. We'll find out here in a little while. One of the advantages of a diesel engine is the increased fuel economy. This particular car right here was the first car ever and since to run the entire Indianapolis 500 without ever stopping for fuel. He just drove the car around, only used, I don't know, they said in today's dollars, used $18 worth of fuel. It was, at the time, he spent $1.25 on fuel, and because it just had good fuel economy. It got about 13th place because it was slow and heavy, but he never had to stop. He went on to a couple other Indy races, but the last Indy race he raced was in 1952 with this one here, and he dropped out of the race in lap 71 because the turbocharger was sucking up chunks of rubber from other people's cars, and so he couldn't keep going. But at the time, he was at 131 miles an hour average. His average speed was 131 miles an hour, and 132 mile an hour was the person who won. So this car was a super good competitor in that. But the following year, 1953, they figured out that diesels were going to outdo the gas engines because they're better fuel economy and the power that they could produce and where they were going with them. And what they do, change the rules so that diesels couldn't be in Indy anymore. So this was the last car of the race at Indy, and it never finished. Okay, so big deal. Just want you guys to get a little bit of history about what's going on with in the past with diesel engines and what that means. There's if you read inside your canvas, I think there's even some more stuff which isn't, you're not getting tested on or anything, but if you're interested in it, there's some more interesting stuff in there. So let's talk about Ford's history with with diesels, and we'll kind of end up with the diesels that you'll likely be looking at in today's world. Before I get into this particular diesel here, Ford actually had, in about 1985, we had a diesel Tempo and a diesel Escort. And they were these little heavy, slow, stinky, leaking little diesel engines we had in those cars. And then we also had a diesel in a Ranger. Didn't see very many of them at all, but they were out there. There's probably none still on the road anymore, so it probably really doesn't matter. But they were just very old school kind of diesels. Okay, so in 1982 is when Ford started putting diesels into pickup trucks. It was a 6.9. It was naturally aspirated. It didn't make a lot of horsepower, didn't have a lot of anything. It was actually kind of a slow engine. People loved them. They had a lot of torque. You could tow with them and stuff. Had a really high compression ratio. It was an indirect injected diesel, which we'll talk about later today, what that means. It was very simple, old school fuel system. It had a rotary injection pump on it, which we'll kind of cover in fuel systems briefly, just how they operate, and it doesn't really matter. You won't, you'll see a couple of these on the road, and you won't get into too much of it, but just a very basic old V8 diesel engine. Okay. But this is the engine that started it all. This engine then in 1987, they stroked out. I mean, they bored out this engine from a 6.9 to a 7.3. It had the same stroke, but they just made a bigger bore. They did some other things. I think they straightened the block. They strengthened the heads a little bit. Minor, very minor configuration changes. But for the most part, it was exactly the same configuration as the old 6.9. It had a different glow plug system on it, but the fuel pump and the injectors and everything were all very similar, Stanidine rotary pumps, and nothing fantastic about it. It only went up. It didn't have much of an increase in horsepower and torque. Let me take a look. It said 315 pounds of torque, 170 to 100. Went again 15 horsepower and 30 pounds of torque. So wasn't a whole lot, but we used this engine from 87 to 1993. And it was, and then we also introduced in 1993 a turbocharged version of this engine. And the turbocharger was not added to this engine to make it have more power. It was added to this engine so that they could operate it legally at higher altitudes, because one of the problems that a diesel has with when it's an old school kind of injector pump like that is it has no ability to make adjustments for altitude and air pressure changes and air density problems. And so they added a turbocharger to this, so this thing could work well from sea level all the way to top of Pikes Peak, which is what 8,000 or 9,000 feet or whatever Pikes Peak is. So that was the reason they did that. It made, in order to accommodate that turbo, they changed the pistons. I think they put some anodized pistons in there. But as far as I know, the heads and blocks and all that stuff were all completely identical. But these were all indirect injected engines. Okay, the other two were naturally aspirated. This was turbocharged, but they were all basically the same indirect injected V8 engines. The anything else I need to kind of bring you up to speed on this? I don't. You probably never see one of these. We get one of these in the shop, but one a year or something like that. But they're never all that great. One of the things they said in this last slide is the 7.3. That when they came out with this 7.3, they say, "Oh, this is the 7.3 that started it all." It is not. That is not true, because when a 7.3, even though this was 7.3 liters, it's not the same as the 7.3 PowerStroke engine. So in 1994 and a half, we introduced the PowerStroke 7.3 turbo. That was the first year that was a direct injected, computer controlled HUE fuel system diesel engine. Okay, and we're gonna talk about what direct injected means, HUE fuel systems. So we're gonna talk about all of that stuff so that you guys you'll know what it means. But this was the engine that started the whole thing. at the end of the day. This was a real powerhouse. This particular engine, when it was introduced, was turbocharged. However, it was not intercooled. It only had a turbocharger. When it was introduced in 1994 and a half, it only had a manual transmission, and it was a very early EC5 computer system. It had lots of, and I don't know if you guys are familiar at all with Ford's history with diesel engines or anything, and they talk about the 7.3 being this great engine and the 6-liter being a problem. When this engine was first introduced, it had lots of problems. It had problems with injector O-rings, which we'll talk about injector O-rings when we talk about HUI's systems, and we're going to talk at length about HUI injection systems and the problems with their O-rings and all that. It also had problems with cam position sensors going out, and all kinds of problems with those. But once they figured out all those bugs in this thing, this engine was an absolute workhorse. I get these engines in regularly that have over 500,000 miles on them and have no issues. Okay, so they're super reliable, super well-built engine. So if you look at comparing those other ones, we went from 135 horsepower to 210 horsepower and clear up to 425 pounds of torque. Okay, finally getting some muscle in there and a really well-built engine. But we went further with that same basic engine in 1999. Kind of revamped it a little bit. They put a electronic fuel pump, supposed to a mechanical fuel pump on it. That's strictly on the low pressure fuel system. This was a HUI oil, a HUI injection system, but this thing, they added an intercooler to it and bumped the horsepower 235 and 525 pounds of torque. This engine, from 1999 to 2003, they built this engine in that configuration in the F-Series truck. They put it in an F-Series truck and they put it in the Econolines, and it was an absolute powerhouse. Super reliable, super well built, arguably one of the best engines built out there. It was really well. Let me go back just one thing, just to say, from the 1983 6.9 to this, these were all built by Navistar. Depending on what year it was, is either International and Navistar. They changed the name of their company every other year, I think, but they were built in a joint effort between Ford and Navistar or International, and but they were actually built in a Navistar plant. So Ford had a lot of say in it and everything like that, but these were International motors, okay, and so you would find these engines in International trucks as well. What else is interesting I need to talk about on this engine? It was, I think that's probably good enough. It was turbocharged, intercooled. Okay. So then in 2003, it was 2000, in year 2003, emission standards changed, and state of California, which pressured the federal government, said that we need to put EGR valves on diesels. Okay. Now, if we went back to the 7.3 and all the ones before that, they literally had no emission controls on them. They may have had catalytic converters in the exhaust, but as far as the engine itself, there was no emission controls on them at all. In 2003, the government made them put EGR on there. EGRs, and we'll talk about this at length in a couple of weeks, but EGRs are to reduce NOx emissions. NOx emissions are created when combustion is heated above a certain temperature and under certain pressures. It causes nitrogen to oxidize, and we end up with NOx emissions out the tailpipe. Some NOx emissions are okay, like nitrous oxide, it comes out the tailpipe and that's okay. But most of the ones that are dangerous also go out the tailpipe. Okay, so we needed to reduce that. So they were forced to introduce EGR systems onto diesels. So the 6-liter got an EGR cooler, or got an EGR valve, and it got an EGR cooler. Okay. So this engine was built also by International, and it was as an engine. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the 6-liter and its history and and all the minutia around it, but it was a big problem. There's lots of problems involved with the 6-liter, but those problems did not involve the engine. The engine itself was strong. It was that we didn't have piston problems. We didn't have crankshaft problems. We didn't have anything, but they had some cylinder head issues that were from manufacturing, cylinder head gasket issues, but they ultimately got those taken care of. But they had lots of EGR cooler problems. They had turbocharger problems. They had injector problems. They had lots of problems. But when this engine ran, it ran good. They had 325 pounds or horsepower, 570 foot-pounds of torque. It made the 7.3 look like it was sitting still. It really ran good. It was a good engine as far as that was concerned, but it had lots of problems. It had enough problems where I actually put 2 room additions on my house because I made so much money fixing these. But having said that, I would own one of these. If I needed to have a diesel, I would own one of these because they really run nice. They're responsive, they're strong, and they're good. You just have to be careful with some of the stuff on them and make sure that it runs right. Okay. So lots of problems with it, enough problems with it that International and Ford, there's lots of lawsuits back and forth about it because Ford bought a lot of them back, a lot of money back and forth. And Ford and International started having lots of problems. But it only lasted, we built this, we used this thing for 2003, 4, only part year for 2003, 4, 5, 6, and 7, and only part year for 7. So it was about a 5-year run on this motor. And we had to dump it, and they came out with a 6.4. 6.4 was nothing more than a kind of a glorified 6-liter as far as the design and the block and everything. It was made a little bit better. It had bigger head bolts, a little, we didn't have head gasket problems with it because of it. Had a way massive cooling system on it that the cooling system was so big that it became a problem in and of itself. It had they ditched the Huey injection system and went to a common rail system. Again, we will cover what that means in a week or so. It too had EGR on it, but we had 2 EGR coolers, and we really didn't have a ton of problems with EGR coolers. It had a twin turbo design, or two different turbos, which we'll talk about turbochargers in a couple of weeks as well. But it had 2 turbochargers, intercooler. It was super powerful, super good engine, but it was an exceedingly expensive engine every time it broke. It had plenty of its own problems. The high pressure fuel pump was inside the engine under a cover. So if it leaked fuel into the engine, and then that fuel in the engine would then dilute and ruin the engine, or it would run away and burn itself down, and all kinds of problems like that. Okay, this is the first engine that came along that in 2007, January 2007, they had to put what they call DPF, which is a particulate filter in the exhaust. We have a filter in the exhaust, which we will cover in a couple of weeks as well, probably about 3 or 4 weeks. But so that engine had a huge emission package attached to it, but it was wrought with problems as well, and it was very expensive. We joke in the industry that we can't open the hood of a engine that has a 6.4 in it without spending $2,000, starting at $2,000. Now, just so you guys get a little perspective on life, to replace an engine on a 7.3 costs about $12,000 to $13,000. The 6-liter to change an engine out runs somewhere between $13,000 and $18,000. This 6.4 runs somewhere between $12,000 and $18,000. And then the 6.7, we'll sort of talk about here in a minute, is a little bit cheaper to change out depending on how it's configured. But you can, one of these 6.4s, if you buy it complete with turbochargers and everything, put it in there, it can be $19,000-$20,000 by the time you're done with it. So a lot of stuff's really big, really expensive. But we'll talk in a little while here today about the fact that they're really, as a whole, a diesel engine is much more durable than a gas engine for what you're getting out of it. All right, so with the problems that Ford was having with Navistar and in their engines, Ford engineers decided to scrap the whole alliance between International and Ford that had been in place for over a decade. And Ford decided to build their own POWERSTROKE diesel engine. And this engine's a POWERSTROKE, but it was dubbed the Scorpion. Okay. And this is the 6.7. This is the engine that's currently in use in the trucks today. It was introduced in 2011. It's undergone a couple of evolutionary changes. We had problems early on with some of the connecting rods wanting to go bad. And so they later versions, I think in 2013 and later, had a bigger connecting rods in them. This is turbocharged. It's turbocharged with EGR cooler with a common rail fuel system, has DEF, which is diesel exhaust fluid, and DPF, which is a particulate filter. The DEF was something that in January of 2010, when this was introduced was January 2010, they had to go to adding exhaust fluid into the exhaust stream to help reduce NOx even more. This thing has in 2011, 12, and 13, and 14 were all one particular engine, and then in 15, 16 was another, and then 17 through 19 is yet another, and then 20 is yet another. But they're all, the engine itself was basically the same. Most of the changes had to do with turbochargers and whatnot. This engine comes in two versions. In the early years was a cabin chassis or a pickup or a work truck kind of engine. And then there was also the pickup engines like a regular pickup would have. Little regular pickup engines developed horsepower way faster. It had a dual stage turbo in it. It was made horsepower a lot quicker. The pickup or the cabin chassis versions for the big trucks and stuff had a single stage turbo, and it made as much horsepower. However, it made it slower so that you could pull those big loads without tearing the engine apart. That's one of the things that the 6.4 had a problem with, is it made so much horsepower so fast that they put them in these big 550s that were way overloaded, and that engine would just give it all it wanted, everything you wanted, and it just destroyed the engines. Okay. So this engine here has been a super good, super strong, super reliable engine. I mean, not without its problems. No engine is, but it's been a really strong, good motor. So we've had it since it's going on. We introduced it in January 2010, and we're going on January 2021 right now. So that's 11 years. So been around a while, and it's super reliable. So, and it's not, as far as I know, it's not going anywhere anytime soon. Okay, some of the other ventures that we have out there is we introduced in 2018, I guess, the 3-liter V6 POWERSTROKE for the F-150. And it was, again, developed by Ford. It's kind of copied off of a Land Rover design, and not a ton of them out there, but we don't have any problems with them. Been super, super reliable. It's belt-driven camshaft, which there was a lot of argument as to whether that was a smart thing to do or not. And I don't know. I wasn't the engineer there, so I don't know the reasons why they did what they did. But it's very similar to the 6.7 in the fact that it has common rail fuel system, EGR, water-cooled, water to air, intercooler, and all that. That's something that's unique about the 6.7, which we'll talk more about. We'll talk more when we later on in the course here about some of the unique characters of these individual engines. But normally an engine would, let me see if I can annotate this here. I'm going to draw you a line, I think. Normally you're going to have exhaust manifolds that are going to come out. See if I can give you a color here. Oh, come on, come on, come on. I want to draw you a line. Oh, I was going to try to draw you in color. Can you guys see where I'm drawing down here? Usually you're going to have exhaust manifolds come out the bottom side of the head like a regular, gas engine or something like that. Well, the unique design of this is that I really need to get some color in here. Let me see if I can do that. There we go. Is the intake manifolds come from the top and they're built into the valve cover here. And the intake manifold comes down and it draws air into the bottom of the head down here. And the exhaust manifolds are actually up on top of this engine. So they go straight into the turbochargers up here. And it creates a situation where we're not losing the heat from the exhaust into the turbocharger, and it's super efficient, and it works really good. It's a really neat design. Get rid of my little drawings here. And stop that. Okay. But like I said, the 3 liter has been something that we haven't had to work on very much at all. Been a very reliable engine. Okay. The other one we have out there is a 3.2 liter inline 5. It's a straight inline 5-cylinder diesel engine. It was Ford's had it around for years in South Africa. It's built in South Africa, but they use it in Africa and stuff. But Ford brought it into the United States in 2015 to put it in the Ford Transit. Super powerful. I mean, we got 350 foot-pounds of torque. Really been very reliable. We've had a few little problems. They have EGR cooler issues. It again has EGR, DEF, and DPF attached to it, intercooled, turbocharged diesel engine. But it's been really reliable. We've had to change a couple, but nothing really big. And it drives really nice. I've taken, like I told you, I coach a shooting team, and we'd take one of these things from the dealership. We'd fill that thing up with people and ammunition. I mean, really heavy. And we'd go and get, 25 plus miles a gallon and go up the hills like nothing. It was super nice engine. So, and then we have the 4.5 V6 that we had from, I want to say we put it in 2006, probably to 2008. Low cab forwards. Low cab forwards is this little tilt cab thing that Ford and International built together. This was a international venture, and the cab and the truck itself was international as well. And Ford bought them from them and marketed them as the low cab forward. The 4.5 liter was nothing more than a 6 liter with 2 cylinders cut off the back of it. Had the same pistons, the same injectors, the same rocker arms, the same everything. The only thing it was a little shorter. It was a Huey fuel system. It kind of had a dual turbocharger setup on it. Super wrought with problems. It was just a terrible motor. It leaked. It broke down. It broke things. People hated them. Lots of problems with it. But it was out there, and there are still some floating around. I still get them come in the dealership. They didn't carry any kind of a Ford computer system on them. They had an international Diamond Logic fuel injection system and a computer system, which made it cumbersome and terrible to work on at a Ford dealership. It was just just lots of problems. But just wanted you to know that that's out there. And I think that's all I have on the history of the diesel. Anybody have any questions about Ford diesels and all of that up to this point? Am I boring you to tears yet? And trust me, I don't think there's any of this on a test, but I want you to know it anyway. Okay. So I'm going to start a new share with you. Okay, and we're going to talk about some of the unique characteristics of a diesel engine. We're going to talk about what's in them, what makes them different, kind of what makes them tick. Okay, so this stuff here you need to pay attention on, because some of this stuff, there's not a huge test at the end of this week, but there is a test, and you need to know this stuff, and some of this stuff is really important. Okay, so you probably figured it out. I don't know what, do you guys have any working knowledge of the difference between a gas engine and a diesel? You can turn on your mics and tell me yes or no. Crystal, do you have any working knowledge of the difference?
No. All I know is diesel compresses instead of.
Well, they both compress.
No, but the power stroke.
Yeah. But we're going to explain that. Arturo, what about you? Any working knowledge of the difference of a diesel and a gas?
Well, I just know that compression is used for diesels.
Yep. What about you, Gavin?
Yeah, I don't know too much about the differences. All I know is that it doesn't use spark plugs. It uses a different kind of fuel, and that it's based off of the compression. It's based off of more force than it is the spark.
Okay. Well, I want you guys need to understand how all this works. So if we get through, if anything, just stop me if I don't explain myself well how it all works. But so diesel engines, you guys know, they have no ignition system. Okay, like a spark engine, a gas engine has a spark ignition system. Okay, diesel engines are heavier, they're more durable, and there's reasons for that. They use a timed fuel injection system for their ignition. So when we say they don't have an ignition system, they don't have anything unique as far as the ignition system is concerned, but they have a fuel system that works as an ignition system. Okay. They operate in an air-rich combustion. Okay. What that means is that a gas engine, typically, unless you get into some of the newer direct injected ones, but a gas engine runs a stoichiometric air fuel mixture. In other words, the air that's compressed in a gas engine and then fired is a specific mixture. 14.7 to 1 air to fuel is stoichiometric for a gasoline engine. Okay, if you deviate from that in a gasoline engine, you will either blow black smoke out the tailpipe or misfire from a lean engine. It is critical that a gas engine is kept that way. A diesel engine, what are we doing? We're compressing air. That's all we're doing is compressing air, and then we're injecting fuel, either a little bit or a lot of it. But we're injecting fuel in there, and that's what makes a diesel engine operate. Okay, so it's a air-rich environment. Okay, so it doesn't do things at all the same as a gasoline engine. Okay, diesel engines produce higher torque. I'll explain that in a couple of slides here. It's why it does that. They produce lower emissions. Okay, we can argue that. There's lots of arguments back and forth about that, but our hydrocarbons and our carbon monoxide going out the tailpipe of a diesel are way lower than a gasoline engine. Our NOx are higher, but we treat those, and our CO2 is lower than a gasoline engine. One of the things a diesel engine does produce, though, would be particulates. You get lots of little chunks in the air or whatever. So We have particulate filters to treat that as well. We use after treatment systems to deal with all that. The after treatment systems are probably one of the systems that causes the biggest headaches in a diesel engine. And we're going to spend a considerable amount of time talking about those systems. But with those systems in place, a diesel engine can produce way more horsepower for the dollar for a gallon of gas than a gasoline engine, and we can have less emissions. We get higher fuel economy out of a gasoline engine or a diesel engine. Okay, so our advantages: superior fuel economy, exciting performance characteristics. You get in a pickup truck, you know, any one of our F-250s, 350s, in a gas engine compared to a diesel engine, man, that diesel engine makes that gas engine looks like it's standing still. Okay, it has rugged durability. We'll talk about why it does here in a minute. We have superior towing abilities because we have more torque, and we have a more favorable environmental footprint. Diesel engines use less fuel to produce the same amount of horsepower, and it has to do with diesel fuel. Okay, the way diesel fuel works and the higher compression ratios. With the higher compression ratio, we can make more power. Okay, so the way diesel fuel has more energy per gallon of fuel, so we can get more work out of that same gallon of fuel than you can out of a gas engine. And we're going to talk ad nauseum about diesel fuels and what they are and how they work, and biodiesel fuel and all of that here next week. Okay. Because of the higher compression ratios, we can make more power. Then I think we've already talked at length on that. So we have higher compression ratios give us the ability to have lower fuel consumption. Okay. So the higher the compression ratio, fuel consumption goes down. Okay. So the reason we can do that with the diesel is because of the way that we're running the engine. We're not running. Let me go a little bit. I'll explain that in another slide. So this is an interesting fact. The heavier, the more load we carry on a diesel engine, the better our fuel economy becomes. And that doesn't mean that our fuel economy is going to get better the more load we carry. It means that we can carry more load with the same miles per gallon. This, on average, an 18-wheeler that carries an 80,000 pound load gets around 7.5 miles a gallon. That's pretty doggone good. If you took that, if you just took mathematically and divided that 80,000 pounds to a 4,000 pound pickup, okay, you divide that by 20 to get to that, and you did the same with your miles per gallon, we would end up with 150 miles per gallon on that little car, on that little pickup. But it doesn't work like that. But because of the energy and the compression ratios and the energy that's in that diesel fuel, we can carry huge loads with very good gas mileage. That's what makes a diesel so desirable. If you take the same gas engine that's going to tow if you put a boat, take two F-250s, one with a gas engine, one with a diesel engine, and carry the same, boat or something, the diesel engine with that heavier load is going to get way more gas mileage than that gas engine is going to get. So that's one of the biggest advantages of a diesel engine. And I don't know why I'm not sure why this slide's in here, but it's a Dodge. And but they're just comparing a gas engine with a diesel engine here, and how much they get: 420 pounds of torque, and you only get 269 pounds of torque with that gas engine. But our fuel economy is where it really comes into play. Is we got 3 more miles a gallon on the city, and 4 more gallons in the highway. Okay, so at the end of the day, and with a way greater towing capacity, so at the end of the day, your diesel engine is going to be much more efficient to operate. Some of the remember we talked about one of the big downfalls of the diesels in the early days was they were smelly, noisy, stinky, everything, drooling, environmentally disastrous vehicles. Well, with the technologies we have today, we have cleaned up all of that stuff. And with Tier 3 emission levels, which is Tier 3 emission levels is a emission standard set out by the state of California that says that they have to produce or operate at certain emission levels. And one of those requirements too is that they have to be more reliable. We have to make sure that the engines are reliable. And so these engines are kept to a really high standard and run really well. Okay. So the reason that they're going to be more durable, there's a lot of reasons for it, but I think the main reason is that they're built tougher because it takes them a lot more power, to squeeze all that compression ratio. It takes a lot more work, and the higher torque that's coming out of them, there's a lot of work that's been going on there. So we make them, the connecting rods are heavier, the crankshafts are heavier, the cylinder blocks are heavier. So everything's a little bit beefier. Okay. So that helps them, operate more durably. They also operate at lower RPMs. That helps them. They operate at lower RPMs driving on the highway. One of the big things here is it says here washing lubrication from the cylinders. Remember that a gas engine, we have fuel and air mixture inside that cylinder. When that piston's coming up on there, there's fuel and air inside that cylinder. So that piston ring is getting washed continually. That wall is continually being washed by that fuel in there. Okay. Well, that takes the oil off that wall when that piston's coming up on there. And so that causes wear on the piston ring and wear on the cylinder wall. Well, on a diesel engine, we don't have any of that. All we're pumping in that thing is air when we go on our compression stroke. Okay. On our intake and our compression stroke. So we don't have cylinder wear wall at all. The only reason that we get cylinder wear wall on a diesel engine is because people don't change their air cleaner, or their air cleaner fails, the air cleaner system fails somehow, and we get what we call a dusted engine. We're sucking a bunch of dirt in that engine, and it wears the cylinders out. Okay. Beyond that, you shouldn't have hardly any wear on a cylinder block on an engine. Lastly, one of the things that keeps them from wearing out and having problems is because the cylinder blocks are made more rigid, we don't get those distortions like a gas engine is. You get a lot of distortions with gas engines. We have problems with some of our smaller aluminum block gas engines where the cylinder blocks distort, they leak, they like make their head gaskets leak because everything's moving around because they don't have the girth that a diesel engine has. Okay. Now this lower ownership cost can be a myth at some point. Of course, you don't have the ignition parts. You don't have things. There's not a lot of things on a diesel engine that require maintenance per se, maintenance, but like spark plugs and that kind of thing on a gas engine. But they still, there once was a day when like kind of the earlier 7.3s that, were really reliable and you didn't have to do much to them, and you didn't have DEF in the fuel or, in the exhaust, and it wasn't that terrible to work on them. But if you look at today's diesel, I mean, what's it cost to get an oil change on a gas engine now? About $55 or something like that. It's $120 to $130 to change oil on your diesel. Okay. You're still changing it every 5,000 miles. Okay. So there's a big deal there. The cost to purchase the diesel is expensive. If you take that F-150 3-liter diesel, in order to purchase that diesel engine in that truck, you have to buy one of the 2 top trim levels of the truck, and then it's a $6,000 add-on. So so you take the same truck that you could probably pick up for $45,000. That truck is going to be almost $60,000 by the time you're done with it. So the cost of ownership can be really high. Where you get into the cost of ownership being an advantage is the fuel economy and the fuel savings. And it used to be where you had to drive a diesel because of the extra cost of oil changes and the cost to purchase it. It used to be that you had to drive it about 100,000 miles at the break-even point, and then you started to make money. That's crept up to, 150,000 plus miles before you really start seeing a savings over the gas engine. So if you're looking to buy a diesel to save money, ain't happening. It ain't gonna happen real soon anyway. So lower emission levels, we've already kind of talked about that. You're going to have lower hydrocarbons and carbon monoxide, but like I said, we're going to have higher NOx, but we are treating that. So in today's world, in today's, looking at a truck rolling off the assembly line today, that diesel engine is way cleaner than a gas engine. We have gone to extra lengths to clean up those diesel engines. And that's one of the reasons that we have problems with the smaller engines. Like Ford has a nice little 3-liter diesel that runs in Europe that gets over 50 miles a gallon. But in order to keep the emissions going out the tailpipe, you have to add so many things to it. It overcomes the advantage of what it takes to run all that stuff. It just eats up the horsepower, so you've got nothing left of the engine. Okay, so here's an interesting factoid, is that electric vehicles have no emissions coming out of the car themselves. But they actually, how run they clean depends on where the energy source was. If the energy came from a windmill or a solar farm, sure, there would be zero emissions. But if it comes from a coal-fired power plant or a compressed natural gas plant or something like that, then it's not. Okay, but in the reality, if we look at things as a whole, electric vehicles with their batteries and the manufacturing process to make them and after they're done and to recycle them and all of that, man, there ain't nothing environmentally friendly about an electric vehicle. Okay. And if you could take that diesel engine and even most gas engines and just run them efficiently, they're at the end of the day going to be much more environmentally friendly than an electric vehicle. And I know Governor Newsom is pushing to completely get rid of internal combustion engines in the state of California, but at some point we're not going to make enough electricity to be able to operate all of those vehicles unless something changes in the next 15 years. So I don't think it's a good idea, but I'm not the governor. All right, so we're going to switch gears. Anybody need to take a break, or are you guys good to go here? Are y'all awake still?
You're good.
Yeah. Can I use the restroom real quick?
Run. Tell us when you're back. Has anybody started any of the web-based courses yet?
Yes, I finished it.
Proud of you. It's not a bad one though. It's pretty easy. It's a pretty nice one, huh?
Yeah.
I'll what I'll do is let me post all of them all at once so that you can just actually you can just go in and do them. You know how to get in there and do them, right?
Yeah, but I don't know which ones you want.
There's 2 gas drivability, 2 diesel drivability and 2 diesel engine. I want the one that you did on the diesel engine right now, and then go do the 2 drivability ones. The other one, I'm not decided whether I'm going to make you do it or not. Ultimately, if you were going to be Ford certified, you'd have to, but if you go into the one for the 2 drivability ones, those will be the other 2. And one of them's an after treatment one, which is, we'll get into it later in the course here, but let's see if my voice holds up. I sit in a stall by myself and barely talk to anybody, and sit here and talk for 2 hours.
Okay, I'm back.
All right. Okay. So for the purposes of this argument, engines are going to be classified into one of two ignition systems: spark ignition and compression ignition. We've kind of talked about that a little bit. You know, just an interesting side note. If you Google internal combustion engines, and, you know, if you looked at internal combustion engines back in the 1800s when they were trying to develop all these things, there are so many goofy, weird designs out there that people were messing with. It's actually, there's actually, if you find it, there's an animation page that shows the animation of how all those engines work. And it's like, wow, there's some people out there that were really out there thinkers, but that's a side note. Okay. So we have spark ignition or compression ignition. Okay. And one's fired off by a spark plug, one's fired off by heat and fuel timing. So we aren't going to care about spark ignition. We're going to talk about compression ignition. Okay. Compression ignition is the most efficient combustion system. Okay. What we're doing is we're going to take heat created by compressed air. Okay. Air, when it's compressed, heats up. Okay. It's because all the little molecules are rubbing against each other and they get all pissed off at each other. Okay. They're trying to get away from each other. That's what causes pressure. So they're not going to get into a big chemistry lesson here, but when we compress air, it's going to get hot. The more we compress it, the hotter it's going to get. Okay. So, how are we going to accomplish that? In a gas engine, we can only make so much compression. How do we do it in a diesel engine? Okay. So old Rudolf Diesel tried to figure out, and he said, how can he use this to his advantage? One of the problems that a gasoline engine had clear up into about the 20s was that knowing that if we compress that air and we compress it and then add fuel to it, we can get a much greater explosion and get a much greater power out of it. Okay. And much more efficient use of our fuel. The problem with the gas engine was that the higher we compress that, more heat that we make out of that making compression, we have that air fuel mixture inside there, it wants to explode. Okay. And so you couldn't do it. So up until about the 1920s, the greatest compression ratio you could have was about 4-to-1, which is not very much at all. Okay. It wasn't until the introduction of lead in the fuel, which was a artificial octane booster, where they were actually able to increase gasoline engine compression ratios to make them efficient at all. Okay. But old Rudolf Diesel figured out that if he could compress and make higher and higher compression ratios, then he could make more power out of that diesel engine. Okay. So everybody understand the fact that we compress air, it gets hotter. So as soon as that hot air is compressed in there, and it's, it can be, up to 1,000 degrees or whatever temperature it's going to be inside there, then we're going to inject fuel through a fuel injector just before top dead center and make all that happen. It's going to be just like at that point, the fuel is going to explode, and then it's going to make the piston go down. So just that, back to a history lesson here. Diesel, his first engine he was blasting using compressed air to blow coal dust in there, and he had about a 26% efficiency out of that engine, which was, you know, like I said, better than a gasoline engine. Whereas in today's engines, we're getting way higher than that. So the engine itself, though, by design, is very similar to Otto's 4-cycle engine. Okay, we're going to have an intake, a compression, a combustion, and an exhaust. Okay, so the whole idea of the 4-stroke engine is the same as a regular gas engine. You know, it's almost like it was like he stole the idea, just, you know, igniting the fuel in a different way. Okay, so but this is exactly the same, you know, as a gas engine. Okay. Anything you need to know about that we haven't talked about? We're going to talk about compression ratios here. Okay, so how do we attain the compression ratios needed to create all this heat? So compression ratios, and you guys been, Gavin, did you guys talk about compression ratios and stuff in Auto 99?
A little bit, but not as it applies to diesel engines. We didn't really dive into it too much.
Well, it's a, you know, it doesn't matter whether it's a gas or a diesel engine. A compression ratio is the same. Compression ratio is the difference between the volume of the cylinder when the piston's at bottom dead center compared to the volume of the cylinder at top dead center. Okay. So in the example here, a 16:1 would be, if you, with this thing at the bottom, it has 16 units of air, say 16 more times the volume at bottom dead center as it does at top dead center. So it's a 16:1 compression ratio. If it was a 4:1, it would be only 4 times the volume to 1 here, and or whatever, 23:1, whatever it is. That's simply the compression ratio. So we calculate that by just measuring the volume with it down and measuring the volume with a top dead center, and we come up with a compression ratio. Okay, now keep in mind that when we talk about the combustion chamber at top dead center here, when we're dealing with a piston that's a direct injected piston, that piston's going to come up and it's going to be almost touching that cylinder head. However, the top of that piston, and you can kind of see it a little bit in here, it's kind of a Mexican hat design. There's actually some volume inside the top of the piston that gives it its combustion chamber design. And we'll cover combustion chamber designs here in a little bit, but that's how we get compression ratio. However, so how do we get the higher compression ratios that a gas engine has? And we get those, let me make sure that we're not missing anything here that you need to understand. I think we've already talked about that. The difference between a gasoline and a diesel engine has to do with the stroke of the crankshaft, okay? How long a stroke it's going to have. Gasoline engines typically going to have shorter strokes. And then so you don't have the volume at bottom dead center that you do with a diesel engine with a longer stroke, okay? So you're going to have longer strokes so that pistons, you have more volume down here than you do with the gas engine over here, okay? And it's this longer stroke that gives the diesel its higher torque output, okay? And I've got some cool slides here to kind of explain that, okay? So I got the cool little dude over here working against the fulcrum, okay? So when we have that longer stroke or longer fulcrum, or, you know, longer point past the fulcrum, we can carry more load. In the same way, when we're using that leverage on the crankshaft, you see on the long stroke, on the one on the right there, you got a much longer stroke. When you compare that to the dude with the fulcrum, we can get a lot more power out of that crankshaft because we have that longer stroke, okay? That's the thing. That is the key that gives the diesel engine more torque is that longer stroke. Because as it's coming around there, as that power piston comes down, you've got more leverage against that crankshaft than you do the little short stroke guy in the beginning up here, okay? Does that make sense to everybody?
Yes.
So at the same time, that longer stroke gives us the higher compression ratio. Now we've got a piston that's further down in the cylinder. We've got more volume, and now we're crushing all that air up into the top of that cylinder. So that is where we're getting our torque. That is where we're getting our high compression ratios. Now, with the indirect ejected diesels, which we'll talk about here in just a couple of seconds, we're going to have much higher compression ratios. We just need them because of the way they operate. But anything above a 23-to-1 compression ratio, actually, we start to lose benefits of the compression, because it takes so much energy to push that piston up and compress that gas in there. It can do it. The engine could handle it, but it takes so much energy to crush that and do that you lose the benefit of the compressed air as your power source. So it doesn't do us any good to go above 23-to-1. So you won't ever see them that high. But you will, however, see them at 20, 21-to-1, somewhere in there with your indirect injected diesels. But I think I want to say our 6.7 is only around 17, 18-to-1. We don't need all that compression ratio, because part of it is too that we're turbocharging them. And so we're getting more air inside there too. Yeah, this is just talking about direct injecteds are between 15 to 17, and indirections are usually with 19 to 23. Compression pressures produce an average ignition temperature of around 1,000 degrees. Diesel fuel will usually start burning around 500 degrees. That's what kind of makes a cold diesel engine hard to start, is we have to create that heat in order to get that diesel fuel to start. And that's why we have glow plug systems. I think we're going to talk about those a little bit later today. Okay, so the fuel is sprayed into the cylinder. Okay, it is. So now we have our compression up. We're almost at top dead center. We have a super hot air mixture inside there, and we're going to inject fuel in a fine mist in there. So now what the fuel has to do in the blink of an eye, probably way faster than the blink of an eye, that fuel has to absorb the heat, because it's technically cold going in there. It's not cold, but it's not the temperature of the fuel, of the air. So it has to absorb the heat. That causes it to vaporize. Now that has to mix inside there, and then it has to catch on fire or ignite. Okay. Now that it ignites, that ignition in the gas, the burning gas creates, or the burning fuel creates gases. And as those gases expand, they push the piston downward. Okay. Like it says there, the auto ignition is somewhere between 380 and 500 degrees. I think that's a test question, but I'm not positive. During cranking, most engines will produce a minimum of 280 to 300 PSI. And I think that's all you need to know on that. But that's the basic operation of a diesel engine. That compression gets hot, we inject that fuel, and then that fuel, and we're going to talk a lot about stratification of the fuel and what's happening inside that cylinder, so you can understand where engine knocks come from and where all this stuff is coming from. But that's the basic operations of how an engine works. Okay. Diesel engines could use higher turbocharger pressures, since compression pressures are not limited by pre-ignition. Remember, we're talking about the fact that gas engines are really limited by how much compression they have because because of pre-ignition, where with a turbo, we can pack the air in there with a turbocharger, and we can, I mean, we're running the 7.3, I mean, the 6 liters running 21 pounds of boost on that thing. So we're really packing some air in there. We're packing the air in there and we're getting the compression up. We're making that engine super, super thermally efficient. Okay. So turbochargers do one other thing that make this engine really good, and that's they give us volumetric efficiency. What is volumetric efficiency, Crystal? I put you on the spot.
How much air is coming out, right?
You know, how efficiently we are changing the air out in that volume of that cylinder. So if we move all the air out of that cylinder and all new air is in there, it's 100%. But with a turbocharger now, we can get 130, 150% efficiency. So in other words, we can get, because we're cramming the air in there at bottom dead center, we can get half again as much air inside there. So we have super good volumetric efficiency. So now we've got more air, fresh air available. If our engine isn't even 100% efficient, that means we're not getting all the old air out. So we don't have fresh air to add fuel to. So an inefficient engine doesn't work really well. But if we have high volumetric efficiency, that means we're flushing all that air out of that cylinder. Okay. So higher compression ratios provide greater expansion ratios, which produce more power, and we get more use of the fuel. So we get a better air fuel mixture and better combustion. Okay. All right. So the disadvantages of having all those high compression ratios. Okay. We have to make head gaskets have to be made stronger. The heads have to be made stronger. The head bolts are bigger. The blocks are bigger. The crankshaft's bigger. Everything has to be made bigger in order to accommodate all these higher compression ratios. Okay. One of the things that curses a diesel is the vibrations that they make. And what it's saying here is the fact that as that piston's trying to come up on that compression stroke, that is coming up against resistance. And if you watch that crankshaft, as that crankshaft's trying to come around, it's not just spinning free. One of the pistons is pushing it down really well and, is expanding gases and moving the crankshaft along. Well, another one's trying to come up on that compression stroke, and that compression stroke, as it's coming up, and it's hard to squeeze that air that tight. So as it's coming up, it's trying to slow down. The other thing's trying to speed it up. So you end up with all these vibrations going on inside this engine. So lots of torsional vibrations are transmitted to the chassis in a diesel engine, and that's one of the challenges that they face when trying to make that thing nice for a passenger vehicle, is trying to make that thing run smoothly. Okay. So just some of the disadvantages. Okay. Lean burn combustion. What does that mean? Engines, like I said before, that is an oxygen rich air situation. In other words, all we have in that cylinder is fresh air inside that cylinder. And we're going to inject, if we only need a low RPM, we're just going to put a tiny drop of diesel fuel in there, just enough to make it idle at 500 RPM. Okay. So now you've got a super air rich situation where only a little bit of that fuel is coming in there and burning using that air, and it runs that. But if you have a super, under a heavy load and you're trying to do it, you got the same amount of air in there, but we're going to inject more fuel. Now you got a bigger explosion and more power happening inside that cylinder. Okay. And that makes that cylinder obviously going to go faster and more violently. So that's how we are adjusting how fast this engine operates. A little bit of fuel, a lot of bit of fuel. Okay. But that air rich environment causes us to be able to have a much lower emissions. Okay. And reduced fuel consumption. I think we're going to talk about that in a little while here. Well, so the fuel, I think, is there, yeah, okay, there's a slide in here. Fuel stratification. What's happening here when this injector fires off inside the cylinder is not all points inside this cylinder are all the same temperature. Fuel is going to be, you know, it's not going to be all over the place inside there. So you have, and the fuel is not going to burn if it remains a liquid or is too rich. It's only going to burn in its area that it is at a, I think air fuel ratios on a diesel are somewhere around 15 to 19 to 1. And so they're they run in a much leaner situation than a gas engine at 14.7. But they're only going to burn in those areas of the cylinder that it's going to find that perfect stoichiometric for that diesel fuel. And I think we're splitting hairs here in the fact that how it all operates inside that cylinder. But I just want you to kind of know that as that diesel fuel hits inside that cylinder, it's not all burning all at the same time. And we're going to get into reasons for that and the reasons they knock. You know how diesel, you hear it, they knock as they're running. That knocking is because that fuel has a delayed burn. As that fuel comes into that cylinder and it takes a little while to finally catch fire. And when it finally burns, it burns super violent and super fast. And that causes that fuel knock. And so knowing that about diesel fuel, they have devised fuel injection systems that are called port or a pilot injection or split slot injection that starts a flame, a small flame going across there with a little bit of fuel. And then once you got a good flame going across there, then we inject all the rest of the fuel and it stops that fuel knock because we get a better, cleaner burn out of it. And we'll talk more about that when we get into Huey injectors. Hueys were the first ones that they did that with. But this whole idea of fuel stratification is the fact that as the fuel comes in there and burns, it's all sitting, and this all happens at the fraction of a second, but that fuel comes in there in all kinds of different layers and then finally catches fire and burns. But the point of one of the advantages of a diesel engine is the fact that fuel is heavier and it burns longer. A gasoline engine, you know, by a third of its stroke is all done burning its fuel, where a diesel will burn its fuel almost entire stroke, or at least 70% of the stroke. So that's another reason you get all that extra torque, is because you got that long stroke and lots of push on that piston. Okay, so let's talk about, we're going to turn the corner a little bit. We're going to talk about combustion chambers, the combustion chamber designs, and how they affect things. So good combustion chamber designs are going to they're going to promote good combustion, help stop emissions, minimize noise, give us better fuel economy, better, smoother operation. All of the above there, it's going to try to, what they're trying to do with how they design combustion chambers. Now, in a gas engine, most of the time your combustion chamber is strictly inside the cylinder head. But in a diesel engine, most of the time your diesel engine is going to be a flat cylinder head, and any part of the combustion chamber is going to be inside the piston. So just a little bit kind of different how they do that. But when we say combustion chamber, we're going to talk about an indirect injection engine here first. And that indirect injected engine actually has a pre-cup or a pre-combustion chamber in it. Okay, so the two basic designs that are out there are the indirect and the direct. Okay, so the direct injection, which is currently in use today, I don't know of anybody that's using an indirect, but I could be wrong. Some of the smaller engines might still use them, but it's the most popular because it's the simplest design. It's got really good emission characteristics, and it's really it works well with electronically controlled fuel systems. Okay. And we can use smaller injectors, so we can use 4 valves and all kinds of stuff. Indirect injected chambers were the most popular design in the early days. Anything early always had an indirect injection or indirect combustion chamber. And they could use them because they could use them for high speeds. They would, some of the early engines were nothing more than, like, Chevy made a diesel engine that was nothing but a gas engine turned into a diesel. And it just made it really easy to be able to just turn it into a diesel. The fuel systems for them were inexpensive. So what is a indirect injection? Okay. When we say indirect injection, that means that, well, direct injection means we're going to directly spray the fuel into the cylinder. When the time comes, when the piston's at the right time, we're going to just put the fuel straight into the cylinder. In an indirect injection, we're going to put a fuel injector, and this is probably not the greatest picture of this, this is the best one I can find, but we have what we call a pre-cup, okay? And this is a pre-combustion chamber. It's just a little combustion chamber here off the side. And as this air comes up in here, it's all heated the same because it's all pressurized. And this is, remember that these indirect injections are going to have compression ratios usually above 20:1. So they're really high compression ratios. And we're going to inject this fuel in here. And then the fuel is going to start burning in here. And then it's going to spray the flame, and the gases are going to come out this port in here, and it's going to spray into this piston. And those gases are then going to push the piston down. Okay. You typically are going to have a glow plug in them, and we'll talk about those in just a little bit here. But indirect injection combustion chambers use fuel, and they can use they can use a regular pintle nozzle. They don't need to have any kind of fancy injection with them. The pre-cup is just a small spherical little cup that sits inside there. And I got a pretty good picture one here in a minute. The fuel and the air is mixed and ignited in the pre-cup, and then expands into the main chamber where the combustion is completed. They're capable of much faster RPMs. They tolerate poor grades of fuel without incurring significantly longer ignition delays. They are just all around sloppier engines. All the fuel is mixed in the pre-cup, and then they end up being quieter. And that was one of the reasons that Ford used it in the 6.9 and the 7.3 in the early days, is because it's quieter, because it gets rid of that ignition delay. Remember I said when we inject our fuel, if that fuel doesn't ignite right away, it will, that delay causes that explosion, that later explosion to happen. Well, that doesn't happen in a pre-cup design because of the way the fuel's sprayed into the pre-cup. So I think I have, okay, here is a picture of the head of an IDI, or an indirect injected engine. So these pre-cups, and I don't have a picture of it on the other side, but can you guys see my cursor? Yeah. These pre-cups just push right into the head here. Okay. And they're right in the head gasket kind of comes around here. And this opening right here, the injector, you can see the hole up on top up here. The injector comes from the top of the cylinder head and just squirts inside this pre-cup. And this is just kind of got a small spherical space inside there. And once that flame and fuel starts on fire inside there, it's just blown out of this hole, and it just blows down on top of the piston and pushes the piston down. Okay. So they're quieter. They say they have less emissions, but they were wrought with problems because you had to have higher compression ratios. You had to have a glow plugs to start the engine. So that is an indirect injection, and we don't use those anymore, or we don't. Ford doesn't. If they do, I will tell you, but they don't. So then we go to direct injection. Direct injection pistons the combustion chamber is actually in the piston itself. You can see in here the combustion bowl. This is called a Mexican hat design. You can see this is kind of a picture of it like that. It's just kind of got the sombrero design, they call it. So, but we're going to spray the fuel directly on top of the piston. So it's going to spray, and you can see we're going to have a multi-port nozzle that's going to spray fuel out of several nozzles, out of several little ports in here, and it's just going to spray evenly across the top of that piston. Okay. Let's see, is there anything in here you need to know that's not boring you to death? One of the things that we can do with with direct injection usually, which we couldn't actually do it with the 7.3, but with some of the smaller designs is we can have 4 valves per head. And one of the advantages of having 4 valves per head, or having greater valves, is we can have more efficiency, so we can get the air in and out of this thing easier. Okay. Like I said, the combustion chamber is formed on top of the piston and not in the head. The head is flat on those, just like it was. You can see even here, the cylinder head is flat. Any part of the combustion chamber, you're going to have the pre-cup inside of here, and you're going to have some sort of a design like this on the piston. But all diesel engines, their combustion chambers formed inside the piston itself. So direct injection is going to have a much higher thermal efficiency than the indirect injection. So we just end up with a much more efficient engine. We can get the fuel sprayed out in there. We can get with those 5 injector holes, which we'll talk about when we get into the direct injection, stuff like that. We can get that fuel in there in a very fine fog and get it mixture, get it mixed. Remember, the fuel's got to get in there. It's got to get hot. It's got to get vaporized so that it can then burn. So we can do that much quicker in a direct injection engine. Okay. So we can have opening pressures around 3,200 to 5,000 PSI on these injectors, which again, we'll talk about in fuel injectors and high pressure systems ad nauseum here next week. Okay, so here's the difference in those kind of nozzles. In the indirect injection, all we're doing is just spraying a slug of fuel inside there. With the direct injection, we're going to spray out of probably 5 little holes in there. And so we're going to more efficiently spray the fuel into the cylinder and get a better atomization into that fuel or into that cylinder. Okay. So at a cold idle, we aren't putting hardly any fuel into that cylinder in order to make it operate on a cold engine. Okay. One of the problems we have with a diesel engine is it is, like I said, all it is a giant air pump. So it always wants to cool down. If you just let an engine sit in idle, it'll cool down. It won't, if you get it to operating temperature and then it'll just, drop down, they'll usually sit in idle around 150 degrees. And that's not good for emissions. They need to be hotter, and it makes it very difficult when the engine's cold. We want to warm it up so the passengers can have heat in the car and stuff like that. So they do all kinds of different things to try to heat these engines up and get them warmed up when they're cold to get them up to temperature. And they'll turn off. We'll put exhaust back pressure devices in there, which keeps exhaust in the cylinders longer and causes them to be less volumetric efficient. So that hot air will stay in there longer and cause the engine to warm up better. It puts it under a load. It makes it heat up better. A diesel engine, when it's not under a load, will be really quiet. But as soon as we start putting fuel energy into that thing, they start heating up pretty quickly. Okay. And here's just a picture. It's kind of, I think it's blown up, obviously blown up too big. But in comparison, just try to compare how little fuel you need to idle a diesel engine. If the big one was a droplet of diesel fuel, which I don't know how big a droplet, I'm not sure how big 25 to 28 millimeters cubed is. Not very big, but in comparison to that picture there, how small of amount of fuel compared to a droplet of fuel it actually takes to run a diesel engine when it's sitting there at low idle. It just doesn't take very much fuel to run a diesel engine. They're very, very efficient. Okay, this is back to using exhaust back pressure devices to try to heat them up. If we close off the exhaust, or what they'll do is if on engines with turbochargers, with variable turbochargers, is we can change the geometry of the turbocharger, and it again causes the cylinder not to be able to scavenge well, and then it causes the cylinders to heat up. Okay, and if we can keep that cylinder heated up, if we can speed the heat up, then we can get air heater for the customer inside his cab. And it will also help, as those piston rings, remember from our gas engine class, the pistons aren't made round. They're made, kind of cam ground, so that they're not completely round. And as they heat up, they get round, and that causes the rings to seal better because everything's heating up. So we really need to get this engine to operating temperature. So they're going to use all kinds of devices to try to get them to do that. So fuel slobber and wet stacking. What the heck is that? So if the fuel doesn't burn, okay, if the engine's cold, and that's what happens when we're with a cold engine and stuff like that. Can you guys hear that phone ringing? We'll give it a second here. Okay, so not all the injected fuel will burn, especially if it's a cold engine and stuff like that. So we end up, at idle, and they sit in idle and do stuff. And that's why it's illegal to actually idle a diesel in the state of California for longer than 15 minutes. And most of our engines, a lot of our engines will actually shut down. They won't even sit there and idle. They'll just turn off. But you end up with this slobbering because you got cold spots in your piston and stuff like that, and fuel kind of doesn't burn well, and so you end up with fuel half burnt kind of stuff that goes out the tailpipe or goes out the exhaust, and you end up with this what they call fuel slobber and wet stacking, and it's that stuff you see on a diesel engine. You'll see gooey junk liquids and stuff dripping out of the exhaust, and it's not a cool thing. We also have problems with it and you'll get it in the turbocharger. If you get an engine, I've had engines that really have run bad, and you take them apart because the injectors are leaking and they're not running right, they're out of time or something like that. You get all this partial burnt fuel. You can actually scoop this gooey stuff out of the exhaust, because it's that slobber, and they call it wet stacking, and you get this yuck in the exhaust. And once you fix the car and you get that thing running, all that stuff's going to burn out the tailpipe, and it smokes like a steam train. Okay, not cool stuff. Okay, so let's talk about glow plugs for a second, and we'll be done. I don't think I have very much more here, but glow plugs are in a cylinder so that we can heat the cylinder up. Remember, one of the things that when we're trying to heat trying to crank this engine over, we need, you know, at least 500 degrees or something to fire off that fuel. On a cold engine, it's not going to happen, especially on an indirect injected engine. So what's going to happen is we're going to put a glow plug in the system, okay? And all the glow plug is strictly that. It is a device that's usually somewhere between, well, there's several different ones, but some of them were a 12-volt glow plug, and they heat up rather slowly. Some of them are 6-volt glow plugs with 12 volts on them, and they heat up super quick and they glow, and they do exactly that. They if you heat them up, they glow red hot. And so when we put that, we spray fuel against that red hot glow plug, it causes the fuel to vaporize. And then once it's vaporized, then it can explode. Okay. It isn't the glow plug that causes the explosion, but the glow plug helps to vaporize the fuel, so then it can then explode or not explode, but catch fire and burn inside the cylinder. Okay. So we use them in a indirect injection. That glow plug actually sits in the pre-cup. When the fuel hits it, it vaporizes. When it hits the glowing element, it vaporizes so it can burn. We put them inside of a direct injection engine for basically to do the same thing, but we'll also use it in there to help heat the cylinder up when the engine's cold for a certain amount of time for emission controls. So they are such an emission control that now we actually have monitoring systems to monitor glow plug systems, so we can know what each and every glow plug is doing. We monitor the current going through the glow plug. They used to just be a system where you had 8 glow plugs going to the engine. They're off a relay. They turn it on for a little while and start the engine, turn it off, and that was it. However, now they are all go through a glow plug module, and we can monitor them each one individually, so we can know if we have a problem with a particular cylinder. Okay. I think I covered all of this. So just a simple glow plug circuit, very simple in that we just have a relay comes on and heats up individual glow plugs. That would be very simple, like what you're going to find in an old 7.3, the early 7.3, the old 6.9s had that. About year 2000, I think in 99, the early 99 California vehicles, we monitored bank to bank just to see if, each bank was operating correctly. And then in 2000, we introduced a glow plug system that monitored glow plugs individually. There's usually a wait to start light mounted on the dash. It's going to say when we go to start a diesel, turn the key to on, it's going to pop up and say wait to start. That usually there so that you can give the glow plugs a chance to warm up. And then once it's warmed up, you can go to start them. If you took an old 6.9 or 7.3 IDI and started it and tried to start it without the glow plugs, it will not start. The 7.3 would kind of start, and the 6-liter would start without glow plugs, but not always. And depending on the temperature, you need, some of those are pretty instant, but most of the time you got to give them at least a couple seconds to warm up a little bit before they'll start. And then they have the afterglow system, which stays on for a given period of time to make sure that that cylinder is to operating temperature, so that we're reducing emissions going out the tailpipe. Now, we have instant start systems, which is the 6.7, the 3.2, and the 3-liter are all what we would call instant start systems. And they're going to use a completely different kind of glow plug that's going to heat up very, very quickly. I think this one in the 6.7 will get to 1800 degrees in about 2 seconds, which is pretty doggone hot. and it's just made of a different kind of element, and then they'll keep them to that temperature for a given period of time to keep them hot. Yeah, I think it's here. 1.8 seconds. It'll get 1.8 seconds. It'll get to 1832 degrees. So they're using a silicone nitrate ceramics to do that. It's just nothing you need to, I don't think there's any test questions on this. This is, if you want to learn more about this, there's all this stuff is inside your Canvas. These are just really fast glow plug systems, so we don't have to any delay in starting them. Just as a point of information, and I'm sure Ford's probably going down that road eventually, but GM on one of their diesel engines has a glow plug that actually has a pressure sensor part of it, where the element is actually a kind of a little piston that pushes up against a pressure sensitive, some kind of thing, and it actually sends information back to the computer about the compression, the pressures that are actually going on inside that cylinder. Kind of a cool thing, because it's just one more thing they can monitor to know how that engine's running. But we don't have that in ours. So summary: diesel engines are used widely in transportation, construction, mining, emergency, military, power plants, you name it. Diesel engines are the primary go-to. You will not find gasoline engines in all these other applications, but you might find gas turbine, but you're not going to find a regular four cycle gas engine in any of those kind of situations. Diesel engines are usually used for heavy duty commercial because they produce more power, and they use less fuel. Diesel engines in automotive applications has varied over the years, but with the future of the diesel engine, we have gotten more efficient and less emissions. They're quieter. Dude, you could stand next to the new 6.7 and just sit there and talk. In fact, the 3-liter in the F-150, you wouldn't even know that thing's a diesel. You can't hear it run at all. It's amazing how quiet it is. And that's just because of the way they're injecting the fuel and keeping it quiet. Okay. Diesel engines are the most efficient combustion system. We've already talked about that. Anything else you need to know here? Diesel, I don't want to sit and read a slide to you, but yeah, we covered all that. Okay, this is the important part, is diesel engines today can meet and exceed the emissions standards set forth for gasoline engines. Okay. Not only are they as clean, they're cleaner than a gasoline engines. Okay. And that is what's important. And that is the importance of the future of the diesel engine. So diesel engines use substantially less fuel to produce the same horsepower as similar. If you were to compare apples to apples with a gas-fueled engine, the diesel is going to be much more efficient. Okay, and the diesel engines produce significantly higher torque than a gasoline engine. And that's going to be because of the higher compression ratios, which is the result of longer piston stroke and diesel fuel burning longer inside the cylinder. And that is all I have to share with you. And I got you out 10 minutes early. Do we have any questions about any of that? So on Thursday, we're going to start hot and heavy into diesel fuel itself, which is we're going to get, which what we just talked about is everything that's in your week 2. But I wanted to get started. Week 3, I've got a lot. It's getting into diesel fuel is kind of long, and fuel. We get into diesel fuel, low pressure fuel systems, and then we'll start getting into the high pressure fuel systems, the two high pressure fuel systems that you need to worry about. So I'm sure I've already put you guys to sleep enough. Is there any? Did we have any questions about anything? Okay, I'm going to let you guys go, and I will see you on Thursday. Make sure you guys jump into those web-based training classes, and there's just the one test that you'll need to take this week. Okay, I'll see you guys Thursday.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Have a good night.
All right.
Thank you. Have a good night.
All right.